Welcome, fellow colleagues. I am Beth Marchbanks. I'm Professor of Language and Literature at Moberly Area Community College, and I've been there for 15 years, and before that I worked at Mineral Area College for 2 years, so I've been in community college world for long enough that now I'm old enough to be my students' parents. They were born after I graduated college, and some of them grad school. So I'm old. And because I'm old, I have seen the evolution of attention in our classrooms. Okay, and maybe some of you have also been here long enough that you too can follow along with me and relate to some of the ideas. But first, I would also like to introduce my colleagues who are going around the room. So this is Professor Tammy Sells. She teaches psychology, and Becky Allen teaches psychology, and Elizabeth Ward teaches business and office technologies through our career and tech programs at Moberly. And a couple of years ago, I decided that it would be a great idea, with the support of my dean and VP for instruction, to start what I called a faculty book club. Okay, and so the idea of faculty book club, and especially since when I started it, we were in the middle of COVID. Like, I proposed this idea right before COVID. And the idea was that since we weren't doing these in-person conferences, and maybe even some of us, we don't have the funds for professional development to travel to all of the conferences that we would like to go to. And so my theory was that actually we could have a lot to learn from, says the English professor, reading books. And so I started to get a small group of faculty together, and these three were with me in the origination of our book club. And the first book that we read was by Dr. James Lang, who is a professor out at Assumption College in Massachusetts. Some of you, if you read the Chronicle of Higher Education regularly, may have come across some of his work on teaching and learning at the college level. And he just had this new book out, and so I thought, well, what a good book to start with. Distracted: Why Students Can't Focus and What You Can Do About It. The last part is the rub, right? Because we all have seen in our classrooms and even in our own lives this lack of attention to paying attention, if you will. And so over the course of reading this book through the fall 2020 semester, we started to learn some different ideas about distraction and attention in our classrooms, and why perhaps the thing that we most blame for the lack of attention in our classroom may not really be the problem at all. And if it's not, if our brains are still capable of paying sustained attention to things, then how can we, as professors, go about cultivating more of this attention in our classrooms? And so, some of the things we want to talk about today. First, I'm going to give a little bit of Lang's overview on what he calls the history of attention and the theory of distraction. And then my esteemed colleagues here are going to tell you what we can do about it. So, the handout that you've been given has some things in the first page about just general history and Lang's theories and arguments, and then some example syllabus things, and then on the second page is modular instruction, which is a technique that Lang goes into detail about in his book, and then the last couple of pages are about a cooperative technology policy created by Lang and his students that he uses in his classroom. So that's a brief overview of what's going to happen today. So, the research. Now, I present some of this stuff to my students when I talk to them. I have a whole essay that I have, again, English professor right here. So I actually make them write about the role of attention technology devices and what that says about culture. And so I actually have them read a chapter of this book. And when I put the cover up on the screen, I'm now going to pose to you all the same question that I posed to them, which is, when you look at this cover, what do you see in the cover design of that book? What does it make you think of? What'd you say? Notebook paper, but doodles. Stuff's everywhere, right? You have the straight lines of the notebook paper contrasted with the blah, 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 everything everywhere, right? So this then is an illustration of what our minds are like, isn't it? Whether we want them to be or not. So the prevailing theory for the past, probably at least 8 or 9 years, if not close to a decade now, is that it's very easy for us to blame these little devices along with the laptops that all of them seem to have right now. It's very easy to blame these for our students' distractions and lack of attention in class. But history shows us, Lang argues, that we have always been distracted. Our human mind is naturally prone, number one, to distraction, and our human minds actually actively seeks out information. Our phones are very good at giving us information that pertains specifically to us, that is relevant to us, that we can cater. The algorithm knows all, right? We can cater through our phones exactly to us. How can we compete? Me, the, expert language and literature instructor, how can I compete? But we have always been distracted. It just takes different forms. Our brains, as Adam Gazzaley out of the University of Stanford argues, our brains are constantly seeking novelty, meaning new things, okay? That next email, that next social media post, that next video, this, that, the other, okay? It might be nothing, but it also might be something. Our brain constantly craves novelty, okay? Which is why the phones, in particular, draw our attention. However, concerns about our brain's distractibility actually go back as far as Aristotle and how far we can trace civilizations. Concerns have existed about everything from when we transitioned from an oral culture to a print book culture, to when the radio started appearing in people's homes, to when television started appearing in people's homes. And in the 1800s, the earliest scholars were actually complaining about coffee houses that were established in London in the late 1800s. Oh man, those coffee houses, the din of them, I cannot get anything done. This is literally written in the laments of the history books. And now, of course, where do we go when we want to get work done? We go down to the road to the nearest Starbucks or Bread Co. or whatever. I'm always going to call it St. Louis Bread Company, by the way. There is no such thing as Panera in my world. Part of why we are constantly distracted is because our brains are besieged by distractions, okay? We have internal distractions, the things in our own brain, right? Everything from, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? And what am I going to make for dinner tonight and every night for the rest of my life? This is a scary prospect. To, how is my kid going to do at his parent-teacher conference? To, oh my gosh, I really need to read this book. To, oh my gosh, my summative conference with my dean is coming up, and how is he going to judge me? Don't judge me. Internal distractions. Also, external distractions, the distraction in the world around us. People walking in and out of the room, well, that's a distraction. People walking around in front of us, well, that's a distraction. The music and the speaker, well, that's a distraction. Again, internal and external. And so, the history of distraction, as Lang calls it, shows that we have never really been able to listen and pay attention without effort on our parts. It always takes us effort to drag ourselves away from all those distractions of our brain. The problem is, our capacity isn't for attention, isn't less because of technology, but our technology is very good at getting it. Oh, yes, it is. Instead, Lang argues, as college professors, as teachers, we should turn our own attention less toward preventing distraction, like a policy that says you cannot use laptops in your classroom, or put your phones away while you're in class. Less about preventing distraction and more about how do we cultivate attention in the classroom? How do we make being with each other a core value? How do we make students want to be here and want to engage and be mindful and pay attention to what we are doing? And so for the answers to those questions, I turn it over to my colleagues.
Hi, everybody. I don't think I've ever used a microphone before. I'm gonna hang on to this. Which one goes to just that one?
It's the arrows.
Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, hi. Alrighty, so there are a few things that I feel like as instructors with the students, Tammy and Elizabeth are going to talk about some other things, activities and things, but there's a few things that I feel that are very important that we need to present to the students just as far as our commitment to them. And we're talking about how we don't want them to be distracted in our classroom, and I feel like we also just need to turn that around and assure them that we're not distracted also. We're committed to them, we're dedicated to them, and there are several ways to do that. So first on my list, okay, about a year and a half ago, actually at MACC, our dean, Matt Christ, started a campaign to really focus on office hours and talk to students more about why office hours, what are office hours, why are they important, and just start to talk to students about that, because we were kind of thinking, what do students even know what office hours are? I mean, it kind of sounds like we're in our offices doing work, so don't bother us. So we started thinking about just really advertising that. What are these for and why do we have them? So things like, and I believe this is in your handout, but I put a special note in my syllabus. I'm just going to read from it. I called it Student Hours / Office Hours. This time is set aside for you. Please come and see me during these times so that we can talk about anything you have concerns with, anything about the class, any kind of questions, or if you just want to talk about anything at all. But this is time set aside for you, just to assure students that, again, we're here, we're committed, we're dedicated to you. This is our time. This is all our class. Also, another thing that I just put into my syllabus that I feel very strongly about, just a quick shout out to HLC, those of you who have gone through that lately. We just went through our process, and I was on the committee for the first, I'm drawing a blank, the criteria, yes, the mission criterion. And so our thing was to get the mission of the school out there. And so we had a big campaign to print up the mission and have it in frames everywhere. Everyone at our school got a mug with the mission on it, and I actually put it in my syllabus. It's the first thing, just after the name of the course and everything. The mission of the class of the school, because again, just to let the students know we are all here for you. I know that you're here to learn, and this is what you need to do. But this is our mission, is to be here for you, and so we are focused on you. So focus on us. Try to have that, that reciprocal thing. It's a group thing. Another thing that I started doing is just a glimpse into the class. I just started adding this to, sorry, I just brought a syllabus. Just to put this in all of my classes, just another thing to do to assure students that, again, this is a class that is going to be, something that we're all going to be talking about. So it's going to be a complete buy-in. Okay, we're going to all be in here talking about things. So for a general psychology class, I just talked a little bit about it, because students come in and they don't even know what it's really about. What are we going to do in this class? But really, what are we going to do in this class? What are we going to talk about? So I just put in a glimpse in there. What are we going to talk about? What's this class going to be about? And then the we language. Lang talks a lot about using the we word, okay, instead of you. You will do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. Using that we, again, that this is our class. We're going to do this. We're going to talk about this. We're going to learn about this. We're going to share about this. We're all here. And if we want the students to not be distracted in our class, we need to assure them that we're not distracted either. We're here. We're focused on you. We're here for you. We're dedicated to you. And so hopefully that helps all alone, also with the mission that we're trying to do in educating. I think that's all I have there. And so, thank you for changing the slide for me. There you go. Okay, sorry. There's not.
So also in the book, Lang talks about establishing a technology policy. And he talks about 4 different approaches, 2 of which he does not recommend, and 2 of which he does recommend. And so the first 2 are the ones that he does not recommend. And there have been great debates in, educational journals, conversations that go back and forth, like, should there be this laissez-faire approach, which means there's no policy at all, anything goes? And the idea behind that is, our students are adults. They should be able to make decisions on their learning. If they're going to be distracted, then they're just missing out on class. They're just missing out on the information. And, that's on them. And so with that, that's not necessarily great because students really do need to learn how to appropriately use devices. And also, some guidelines are important to have. So it's a good thing to have some classroom guidelines. The second approach is the total ban. And this is no devices at all in our classrooms. And although this may help with reducing distractions, like Beth talked about, there's going to be distractions regardless if it's a technology thing or not. And the benefit of using technology as an educational tool really outweighs that. When we were preparing our presentation, we were actually talking about how students use devices in our classrooms. And one thing that we've seen it increase is a lot of times instead of students taking notes the entire time, they will take pictures of the slides. But then they're very, engaged in the conversation. That's not distracting their learning. They're just spending more time in the engagement part in the classroom discussion versus always just writing notes. So both of those 2 approaches, Lang suggests that we don't take that approach. The third approach, the student-generated policy, that's kind of where he started out. So he wanted to establish a student-led generated policy, but what he found is, yes, it helps students learn about attention and distraction, and it gives them ownership into creating the policy, but he found very little participation. So he really struggled in getting students to actually, and I think he did it in a graduate class too, but he got very little student participation. And so what he recommends is actually the context-specific policy, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit more. And with this context-specific policy, you're looking at when it's appropriate to use technology and when it's not appropriate to use technology. So when it's appropriate to use technology is based on the classroom activity. So sometimes the entire class might use the technology, and some examples might be having the class to watch a video, having some sort of classroom activity like a poll or something like that where the whole class would be using that technology. Sometimes he allows students to have a choice. So if taking notes. Maybe they get their laptop out, or they take the picture with their cell phone with taking notes. Maybe they use an app to look at the ebook as part of a discussion. But then also there are times when he doesn't allow technology in his classroom. And this could be things like a classroom discussion where he really wants people to have input, not draw from their textbook, or even some sort of creative work. With creating your policy, this kind of goes with the warm language in your syllabus, because you would add your syllabus you would add your technology policy to your syllabus, is really using warm language. So this goes two different ways. First of all, as you're in your classroom introducing activities, articulate the use of the technology, meaning as you're transitioning into your activity, remind students like this is an appropriate time, this is your choice to use it, or there's no technology at this time during this activity. So really outlining in those transition periods when it's appropriate to use the technology and when it's not. In addition to that, I'm also going a step further and talking about the purpose of the work. So why are we doing the assignment, or why are we doing the activity? And that goes beyond the technology policy, but really like the learning outcome you're trying to get students to do. Maybe it's like, we're doing this activity to review for your final, this is gonna be on your final, but really going that step further and being transparent. And then also in your written technology policy, including elements like research-based facts, how it relates to your course and classroom. So the next thing, I know it's really small, but it's in your handout. It's on the second page, the front of the second page. He gives a section, and this is something, it's part of the book. He's put it out on the internet, and he allows people to use it and adapt it to their classroom. But this is an example of giving purpose. So he talks about in this section, the first number list, he talks about, some of the research behind attention and distraction that Beth talked about. And he talks about really the why, or the purpose why there is a policy. So that's that first section. Then also in your policy, actually having the policy part. So what activities, and this would be like activities that you do, regularly in your classroom. Go ahead and set those policies in the technology policy agreement that you include in your syllabus. So what activities use technology, what are device free, and then also some tips for reducing distraction and increasing learning. So this is kind of the second section. If you look at that technology policy agreement, the second number list that he has. And so he gives some suggestions like closing tabs, or putting your phone face down on the desk, or even things like, there are times when I'm going to have you not use your phone, and I'll indicate those. And so just being really specific with that policy. And then finally, the last part of his policy has that student engagement piece. So originally he started out wanting the students to come up with a plan for the technology agreement, but they didn't have a lot of participation. So what he suggested is to invite students to give input. So the very last paragraph, there's a part like he gives directions on a time students can meet with him or send him an email if they have any input on that policy. And that could be something like, I have an accommodation that this policy doesn't work for, that maybe you didn't consider in your classroom when you created that policy. And then also having some sort of accountability. This could be a signature. In Lang's example, he has students sign and date and return the policy part. But also it could be like a syllabus quiz, something like that, that really makes sure that the students are accountable and know the policy for that part. And so here's an example of that student involvement part.
All right, so now that we've covered a lot of the policies, let's talk about how it looks in the classroom. So first, let's do a little reality check, right? So how many of you can sit through a 2-hour webinar without checking your email or wondering, your exhaustive to-do list? Anybody? Anybody? Okay, I know I can't, right? So we can't always expect that of our students, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about passive learning approaches versus active learning approaches and thinking about all of this in a modular approach, okay? So think about what competes for your attention. Beth mentioned what to make for dinner. That's always on my mind, right? What are my kids doing? How are their days, right? My exhaustive to-do list, like I had mentioned. What sports activities do I have that night? All things, right, running through our minds. Our students are the same way. So again, we need to figure out and focus on when we are fully focused. What are those times like? Right? So let's talk about some of these methods to sustain attention. All right, so methods to sustain attention. We had talked a little bit about extrinsic and intrinsic things earlier, right, distractions. And in this way, let's talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, okay? So let's reframe it into thinking about rewards, right? Let's talk about extrinsic motivation as far as being rewarded, right? I teach psychology, so rewards versus punishments, whatever. Let's talk about those rewards, right? Me specifically, if you give me chocolate or pizza, I will do just about anything for you. That is a great external motivation for me, right? So what motivates our students? So think about those from their perspective. What motivates them? Sometimes it's a grade, right? Knowing that, I can earn a good grade on this. Sometimes it's just words of affirmation or encouragement, right? Little things like that. Intrinsic motives. So think about things that internally, why I might be personally invested in something. So how this class actually relates to me. What am I going to benefit from this? Right? So those are those kind of internal motives. We have to always think about community building in the classroom. Right? So that's another way that we can build and sustain attention. By building a community. We are humans, and humans at our core, what do we want? What's our number one thing we want? Food, one, yes. Also, we are social beings. We want to be accepted. We want to be a part of a group. We want to be included. So if we build and cultivate that culture in our classroom of we are in this together, right? We're going to see great strides in that. Social pressure, right? One thing that I do is I teach 6 sections of general psychology and a couple of developmental psychology too. So every time we have a quiz to help build that community, I put up my average class scores for every single class and I present it up. And we have these little competitions per classes. So yeah, it might be us versus them with the other classes, but they don't know who's in those other classes, right? They're just focused on us together. And when I show that, and that particular class didn't get the highest score, almost always I have a student go, oh, sorry guys, I didn't study very well, right? They know they've let the class down in some way. So we're getting at building that community. Collaborative learning. I always start with all of your voices are valued, right? And I have it easy teaching psychology, right? So I know it's much harder in the sciences and stuff, but saying that we can share stories in this class. We can all value from relating this content and applying it to our own lives and sharing those instances, right? We all have different backgrounds. We all have different skill sets and different abilities. Let's learn from one another in those ways. Personal experiences, that kind of goes along. And then you might be wondering, why the heck do I have a Lego house and a K'NEX Ferris wheel over here? That's to represent applying that content to existing knowledge and future information, right? So it's always good to think about the Lego house, right? Start with the foundation, build up. How does that matter with sustaining attention? What if I put this crazy long algebra equation up here? Some of you are gonna be like, checked out, right? But what if I say, let's break this down? You have learned this part before. Let's build on that. And then I've got your attention because you know how to do some of this and then grow from there, right? And the Ferris wheel is thinking of like a cognitive map, right? How does this relate to other things that you've already known about? So thinking about it in that way, how can we sustain and grab their attention? Lang says that, oh, I forgot one little thing. The 5 to 20 minute activities. What I mean by that is not thinking about the whole class period as only being 5 to 20 minutes, right? I mean activities within that longer class period, right? So, changing up activities. So Lang says that there's a lot of power within transitions. And so, I don't need to read that to you. So he says, go ahead and change things up every 5 to 20 minutes. Create a transition. And what does transition do? It gives us a time to pause and reflect and then go on. So what happens when you're teaching a class and you notice some people are starting to like check out a little bit, and then you just pause. All of a sudden people are like, oh, what did I miss? Right? Like, oh shoot, I missed something, right? That's a time to pause, renew, and then move on to something else. When you switch activities in some kind of a way, you're grabbing their attention again. Okay, so he says, think about this as a modular approach. So each activity is a module, and he says, think about active versus passive learning approaches, and switch back and forth between the two. So you're like, what the heck does passive and active mean? Well, that's in your handout too, because I'm sure we don't have a ton of time. So I included all of this in the handout. Ideas for passive. Passive means from the student perspective, who is like doing the learning, right? So passive means that it's instructor-led, mostly instructor-led. So the students are kind of passive in that exchange of information, right? So the traditional lecture, unfortunately what I'm having to do right now because I'm limited to 45 minutes. Instructor demonstrations, different multimedia that they're just watching, right? Watching, listening, that kind of thing. When the instructor does an overview of previous class period, how it relates to the current material, what they're going to do next class period, all of that, those are passive. And he doesn't say give those all up, right? They're all important still. But he says switch them up with active learning approaches. And so what I have found is best is to not just come up with activities that sometimes can be meaningless. First, think about what the goal is, right? What is the outcome I want to achieve? And then think, how can I involve my students? How can I get them active in getting that outcome, right? So that's why I have the goal of the activity over here. And I think I also included this in that handout. So if you want them to gather, or if you want to gather information from them, here's some examples, right? For all of these, right? Those are some good examples on how to achieve those active learning approaches, right? And so there's quite a few, and a lot of this came from Lang, but then also like me brainstorming how I do my classes and setting up. What Lang does in his book is he describes an activity, and that's how I came up with some of these other ones, on how you can then think about active learning approaches in your classroom, right? And so this is described in there. And this was some of my initial note cards from the activity that I have described in the handout. So he says, first think about kind of the goal, then think about, or no, he says first come up with the activities that you currently use in class, and then what your goal is, right? I kind of like to flip it, but do what works best for you. Those are some of my cards. And then remember that variety is always best, right? So go back and forth. Start with a lecture, then go to one of those active ones, and then to something else, and swap back and forth. 5 to 20 minutes tops on each activity, right? So don't go all 50 minutes lecturing, right? He says switch it up. And he also says start with a routine. So start with a core 4 or 5, and then for the first couple of weeks, and then start switching them around or adding things in. And one big one is remember that just because a teaching method has worked in the past doesn't mean it always will. And that even goes for that semester. I have classes that I have now that one approach works really well with one classroom dynamic and one doesn't, right? So think about classroom dynamics. Think creatively and reevaluate often. So I think Elizabeth has, or somebody has more classroom activities that they would like to talk about.
So Lang talks about a couple different types of activities. Ritual activities are things maybe you do in your classroom on a regular basis. Maybe it's each class period that you can do. Attention renewal activities are something like if you feel like your class is, losing their attention, like maybe you stop, redirect, and have a couple of those in your back pocket. It's not something that maybe you're doing every class period, but if you're like seeing your students like they're losing attention, you have something that you are able to use and redirect for that class period pretty easily. Also, he talks about some signature activities too. So this is something that you are known for in your classroom. So is there an activity that you just is like the highlight of your class period, and that's like what you would define your class as. For some of my classes, like I teach a lot of online courses, but even though I do online courses, I really pride myself in trying to connect with students. So like when I teach customer service, I get to be the customer that calls my students complaining, and they have to assess and apply the concepts that we've learned in the classroom to satisfy the complaining customer, right? So those sort of things. And then also having low stakes activities. So these are practice activities. He talks about these as like if you were on a team, you would go to practice to prepare your skills and practice your skills. So the same thing with the low stakes activities. And so just in the last few minutes, because I think we just have a few minutes, if you want to pair with the person next to you and kind of think about maybe these 4 different types of activities that we talked about that maybe you use in your classroom. So just, we'll do a few minutes to do just a turn to your neighbor and share. You might just have to share a couple of things. You'll do one.
All right, 30-second warning. All right. We want to turn our attention back to the front. Okay. Who has a ritual activity that you do in your classrooms? Yes.
I start every class with a Mentimeter survey, just like a quick little check-in.
Okay.
And it's, I think, at a technology appropriate time.
Yes.
So they can respond on their phone. It's a way to kind of just like get focused for the day.
Okay, so a check-in, get focused activity. Okay. What would be an example of an attention renewal activity that you tend to do when you feel the motivation sliding? Yes. Oh, whiteboards, yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. If they don't know the answer. Yeah, she was saying she uses whiteboards so the students can write but not necessarily have to speak and hold it up. That's good. All right. What about a signature activity, something that you're known for within your class? Nobody has anything like that? Go ahead.
I do EMT paramedics.
Oh, cool.
We find some bodies and we take them outside and we throw them somewhere. And students gotta go do scenarios and
Hey.
it's normally chaotic. We'll crash a car into something and turn music on real loud and make it as chaotic as possible. That's fun.
That is definitely a fun little signature activity. Man, you EMT and law enforcement people, you have all the fun. And finally, what would be an example of like a low stakes things that you do just to keep students engaged? Back there at the back.
I do clicker questions.
Yeah.
Without technology.
Uh-huh.
Colored index cards.
Oh, colored index cards. I like that one.
They get them wrong.
Yeah. It's just low stakes, just yep, as long as they're trying. Yep, that's a really good example. Again, just something to get them pause, think, not necessarily worth a bunch of points, but just something to get them pause, thinking, active. So, as we wrap up here, a couple takeaways for y'all to remember. Number one, distractibility is built into all of us. And I think we would all do well to remember that. Our students might not necessarily, it's not necessarily anything personal against you that they're not paying attention. It is the way that our brains are naturally wired. And so in that, instead of, scolding, you should not do that, maybe try to provide a little bit of support and understanding, hey, I know that there might be something else on your mind, but I'd really like to talk with your classmates instead of texting on your phone. That's just an example of something that I say to students that's more supportive rather than, hey, what are you doing? But hey, I'd really rather you not do that right now. You can also, and this takes a little practice, learn to anticipate and recognize when attention may be flagging in your classes. And as Elizabeth pointed out, have a couple things in your back pocket, to kind of renew that flagging attention. And as Tammy said, be strategic. 5 to 20-minute activities can do a lot to retain and engage your students' attention. And then finally, my takeaway from the English professor, of course, is buy the book. Or check it out and support your local library. All right. Are there questions, comments, concerns from the room? Because if not, I think we're about out of time. Nothing? Cool. We must have done a great job. All right. Everybody, please enjoy the rest of your days. We will be up front here for a little bit if you have questions. I would appreciate my book being returned to me, though, because I really do like it. Thank you, everybody.